All right, distinguished guests, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here today to the official State Department-hosted zero-day event. The status of women is the status of democracy. Yes. As you can tell, the crowd here is very excited to help kick off a second Summit for Democracy. We are so happy to have you all here and tuning in from all around the world for what is sure to be a lively and productive set of discussions on advancing the roles of women and girls in civic and public life, and a deeper dive into gender-based violence online, harassment and abuse as it grows and is facing significant barriers to the equitable participation of women and girls in public and political life. We have two of our most senior government leaders here with us today, including Assistant to the President and Director of the White House Gender Policy Council, Jen Klein, as well as the U.S. Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, along with an amazing set of two panels and commentaries on which we will have 1 year out from when the summit began on our commitments to bolster women's rights and gender equality as the foundation of strong democracies. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce my dear friend and close colleague, Jennifer Klein, Assistant to the President and Director of the White House Gender Policy Council.
Thank you, Kat, for the warm welcome and introduction. As you know, I am grateful to you every day, to you and your team at the State Department's Office of Global Women's Issues for all that you do. And I'd especially like to thank Secretary Blinken for his leadership in advancing gender equality and human rights and for hosting us today at the State Department. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to those who are joining via live stream. It's a pleasure to be with you. As Vice President Harris has said, the status of women is the status of democracy. So it's fitting that we are gathered here today to discuss the importance of gender equality on the eve of a second Summit for Democracy. The overarching premise for this summit, which is the U.S. is pleased to co-host with the governments of Costa Rica, the Netherlands, the Republic of Korea, and the Republic of Zambia, is that democracies deliver for their citizens and are best equipped to address the world's most pressing challenges. We're here today to underscore that women deliver for democracies. In the wise words of former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, when women are empowered to make decisions, society benefits. Indeed, advancing gender equality is fundamental to our efforts to advance democracy. Research shows that the status of women and the stability of nations are inextricably linked. We know that higher levels of gender equality are associated with a lower propensity for conflict, both between and within nations. We also know that the success of democratic movements worldwide has often hinged upon women's political engagement. Today, so much of that engagement has migrated online. We rely on social media and other digital tools to communicate, exchange ideas, and build movements. But for women, girls, and LGBTQI+ people, and for women public figures in particular, that online engagement is not without its risks. Around the world, technology-facilitated gender-based violence has become the price of participation. This includes gender disinformation to deter women from participating in the public sphere. Today, key findings from a study released by the State Department assessed the tactics that foreign state and non-state actors strategically use to silence women, discourage online political discourse, and shape perceptions toward gender and the role of women in democracies. Online harassment and abuse can have real, devastating consequences for survivors. And as several of today's panelists will discuss, it can literally silence women and girls, forcing them to withdraw from civic participation. The chilling effect of online harassment and abuse against women leaders is not an isolated individual harm. It imperils our democracy, and it cannot go unchecked. Recognizing this urgent challenge, at last year's summit, the United States, along with Denmark, committed to launch the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse, which we'll hear more about in the second panel. Confronting this scourge won't be easy, but together we will rise to this challenge and continue to build the pipeline of women in political and civic leadership. The courageous women leaders, journalists, and activists who continue to use their voices in defense of democracy are critical to the summit's mission. We're honored to stand with you today. With that, I thank you all for joining us for this discussion, and I'm delighted to turn over the stage to the Secretary of State, our gender equality hero, Secretary Tony Blinken.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the State Department. And welcome to the second Summit for Democracy. Jen, to you for your remarkable leadership at the White House Gender Policy Council, to Kat for yours here at the State Department on global women's issues. We could not have a better team, a more dynamic duo leading our efforts, and I'm grateful to each of you every day. Thank you. So we're joined in person and virtually by government leaders from around the world, as well as partners from across the United States government, multilateral organizations, civil society. Thank you. Thank you for all the work that you're doing every single day to advance women's equality and thereby advance democracy. These two things are inexorably linked, as you've already heard. The President has long believed that democracies are strengthened by the active participation of all citizens, particularly women and girls. And since day one, he's made advancing women's and girls' civic and political engagement a top priority of this administration. And that's why we're kicking off this session as one of the summit's first events, because the status of women is indeed the status of democracy. We all know in this room and everyone who's listening in, the rights of women in many parts of the world are under threat and under attack. Repressive governments are passing targeted laws to restrict women's fundamental freedoms, including the right to free speech and assembly. Extremist actors are disproportionately targeting women and girls, especially those from historically marginalized identities, like LGBTQIA people, women from racial, ethnic, and religious communities. But it's not just in autocracies that women are being denied their full and equal rights. In far too many parts of the world, women and girls still do not have equal opportunities to study and work. Women journalists, advocates, politicians, and others are subject to persistent online harassment and abuse. Women who are victims of violence often do not have equal access to justice. Women are subject to discrimination that often puts them at a disadvantage, whether through double standards they face in the workplace, in access to reproductive rights, or in nationality laws, which can result in barriers to accessing education, health care, and property for themselves and for their families. But in the face of these forces, women and girls are leading the charge for their rights and for human rights and democracy around the world. And they're demonstrating the importance of having women at the decision-making table. In Afghanistan, in the face of the Taliban's daily efforts to erase them from daily life, women are still protesting. They're still finding ways to document human rights abuses. They are still fighting for a brighter future for their country. In Iran, courageous women are marching in the streets, under great threat to themselves, to call for women, life, and freedom. The United States stands in solidarity with these women and all who are working for women's full, free, and equal participation around the world. Through our diplomacy, we're committed to supporting them and advancing gender equality worldwide. At the last Summit for Democracy, the United States launched our Support Her Empowerment, Women's Inclusion in New Security, or She Wins, as the acronym appropriately has it. This initiative, which supports local women and women-led civil society organizations, we're working to increase women's political and civic participation in Cameroon, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Papua New Guinea, Uzbekistan, and Yemen. In partnership with Denmark, we've also been leading the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse, a coalition of 12 countries focused on countering technology-facilitated gender-based violence. Soon, you'll be hearing from leaders like Pumzile van Dam, a former parliamentarian in South Africa who shared her experiences as a target of online harassment, and who now works to combat this scourge, including as part of the advisory group to the Global Partnership. We're heartened by the Global Partnership's initial progress over the past year. We've seen some member countries increase resources to combating this issue at home, including by providing more trainings for those in the legal and justice systems, as well as for advocates working with survivors of online harassment. And it is so vitally important that their voices be heard and fully inform our efforts. Others are beginning to collect data to better measure online abuse and its effects. And as a whole, the Global Partnership has worked to build consensus on shared principles to better identify, prevent, and combat this urgent issue at venues from the G7 to the United Nations. So today we have an opportunity to recognize some of these successes, but also to recommit to the work that lies ahead in advancing gender equality. When we succeed, we not only do the right thing, but we also do the smart and necessary thing to make our countries more prosperous, to make them more secure, to make them a little bit more full of opportunity for all of our people. With the group that's assembled here, we've got everything we need to continue making progress toward what is for us an absolutely essential goal. So to each of you who's here today, to each of you who's listening in, thank you again for what you're doing every single day to advance this agenda. And thank you for helping us kick off the Summit for Democracy. Again, what we're doing here today, what we'll be doing for the next few days, these are fully joined. And I can think of no more appropriate, no more important way to kick off the summit than with all of you here today. So welcome to the State Department. Looking forward to some great discussions. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Kat?
All right, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for that call to action, for your ongoing leadership, for being a really cool boss, and your advocacy for women and girls around the world, and to Director Klein for your lifelong advocacy and just your daily dedication. We really, really appreciate it. I will now turn your attention to the screen for a few words from our Summit for Democracy partners from Belgium and Slovenia. Please welcome from Slovenia, President Natasha Pierce-Musar, and from Belgium, Foreign Minister Aja Labib.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak on gender equity and equality. At the outset, let me first stress the obvious. Equal opportunities for women and girls and gender equity as an end result in all walks of life are important, not just for women, but for the entire society. Gender equality is not something that societies need to pay attention to because women need it. We all need it. But gender equality is only the first step. Equal opportunities may not be sufficient for women and girls to overcome several sources of their frequent marginalization. I'm sure that the world has noticed how much Slovenia has changed in less than a year and in which direction. In 2022, I was elected as the first ever female president. The first ever female president of the National Assembly was also elected in the same year. For the first time in the history of Slovenia, a woman has also assumed the position of State Attorney General. And we gained the first ever female Minister of Foreign Affairs. Last but not least, following the parliamentary elections in April of last year, we now have the highest percentage of female MPs ever, 40. These are all important developments for future generations to see that women can occupy the most senior positions in my country. Still, we are far from achieving gender balance. I would like to share with you my experience with an advocacy platform that I co-founded in 2021 with 3 other women. The platform is called Onave, She Knows. The platform allows female experts in any field to publicly share their expertise so that the media and organizers of public events are able to find suitably qualified female experts. The platform has been a success. More than 400 female experts have voluntarily signed up for our online platform. There is now really no excuse for the media or anyone else to know a female expert in a given field. The initiative also has a role in promoting women experts as role models. In addition, I am also pleased to share with you that Slovenia is working on a new feminist foreign policy strategy to ensure the full, equal, and meaningful involvement of women in decision-making processes related to peace, security, and climate change. That being said, I am fully aware that success, challenges, and ways to address them are not unique to my country. In the international community, democratic governance is understood as embracing the idea that women's rights need to be fully respected and that human rights rules are clear. Eliminating discrimination regarding gender and equality should be high on the agenda of every single state. Unfortunately, the actual trends on the ground often point to the opposite. Women continue to be exposed to hate speech, sexism, stereotyping, prejudices, and violence, and even legal obstacles in too many states, with girls having no access to education being just one of them. Together, we must counter attempts at backsliding on universally agreed rights and standards. We must keep fighting on behalf of all the women whose rights are being violated and their voices silenced, often in the most brutal form and beyond comprehension. The relentless activism of civil society and women's groups deserves our utmost respect and support. I'm happy to report that in 2021, Slovenia, following the heavy involvement of civil society organizations, redefined its approach to sexual violence based on the principle, only yes means yes. This legislative change is only the first step, but it is also an important step in the right direction. In addressing these and other challenges, we should never lose sight of intersectionality. Not all women face the same challenges. In particular, we have to pay special attention to the situation of elderly women, who are often the most marginalized and hence particularly vulnerable. Women facing socioeconomic inequalities, low income, and precarious forms of employment are particularly at risk of facing multiple, intersecting, and compounding obstacles in life. Democratic policymaking, therefore, should not be gender neutral, but it should also not be neutral in terms of addressing complex sources actions. They are the systematically produced consequences of marginalization. Such unequal opportunities also prevent gender equity. In conclusion, allow me to stress the following again. Gender equality and equity are needed not just to allow women and girls to enjoy equal opportunities and equal outcomes. They are needed for the benefit of our societies as such. We should not stop at equality. Gender equity is what we must aim for, taking into account the diverse situations of individual women. Accomplishing this goal will improve the cohesiveness of our societies, a quality that is so badly needed in these uncertain times. To illustrate the difference between equity and equality, equality is giving everyone the same pair of shoes. Equity is giving everyone a pair of shoes that fits.
Today, women represent only 1 in 4 members of parliament. And if we look at women ministers or heads of government, the situation is even worse. Many individual women have overcome barriers and are actively participating in political decision-making, but equality is still far from being achieved. Dear participants, when discussing women's equal participation in politics, it is difficult to ignore the patterns of misogyny, intimidation, and violence that women leaders face today. Around the world, women politicians are subject to sexist hate speech and misinformation, very often online. They do not only have a detrimental effect on their human rights to political participation, but they also pose a challenge to democracy itself. By targeting, intimidating, and silencing women, technology facilitated gender-based violence has a particularly harmful effect on women's freedom of expression. It causes them to self-censor and to withdraw from public spaces, both online and offline. It is also sending the message that women in general have no place in politics. Earlier this month, I hosted in Brussels a high-level event on this important topic to identify the sometimes persisting, sometimes new obstacles impeding the political participation of women. Let us be honest. Tackling online violence and intimidation against women and girls is a clear and realistic goal. But it requires more political will and dedication. Let us step up our action to achieve this goal and realize women's equal participation in political decision-making. Because we can't take decisions that impact a community, a country, or even the whole world without taking on board half of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, President Pierce-Moussard and Foreign Minister Lviv, for your leadership in advancing gender equality and for being role models to women and girls and men and boys around the world. I would also like to take a personal note. I feel the spirit of Judy Heumann, one of my personal heroes that recently passed on March 4th here. And I would like to ask the interpreter to teach us how to say women, life, freedom in sign language.
Women,
Women,
life,
life,
freedom.
freedom. All right. Thank you. Thank you all. That's for you, Judy. Just making sure that we remember to be as inclusive and intersectional as possible and how important intersectionality is for all of us, especially when we're talking about democracy and true democracies. Next, we will move our first panel discussion on advancing women's political and civic participation. Our speakers will share the progress that has been made over the past year of action on the Summit for Democracy pillar, Gender as a Prerequisite of Democracy. I am honored to introduce our moderator, Dr. Isabel Coleman, Deputy Administrator for Policy and Programming at USAID. Dr. Coleman, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon and welcome to everyone. This has been a terrific event so far, and I'm really pleased to be able to introduce and moderate this panel on advancing women's political and civic participation. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that just yesterday, USAID launched our Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Policy, which elevates 4 strategic objectives across all of our operations and programming. First, to reduce gender disparities. Second, to mitigate the harmful effects of gender-based violence. Third, to increase women and girls' agency to fully exercise their rights. And fourth, to advance structural changes that address the root causes of gender inequality. The promotion of gender equality is more urgent now than ever. Progress empowering women and girls has stalled as countries face compounding shocks from the COVID-19 pandemic, from climate change and conflict. And we see around the world democratic backsliding also fuels backsliding on gender equality. Authoritarian leaders are launching a simultaneous assault on gender equality and democracy, threatening decades of progress on both fronts. This is not simply because misogyny and authoritarianism tend to occur in parallel, but because they are mutually reinforcing ills. Women's empowerment is not simply an outcome of democratization, but a precursor to it. And through the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security Act and the U.S. Strategy on Women, Peace, and Security, the United States recognizes the critical but difficult task of putting gender equality and women's empowerment at the core of our democratization human rights, governance, and peace and security agendas. We are elevating the Advancing Women and Girls Civic and Political Leadership Initiative as a core U.S. government commitment toward achieving the Summit for Democracy objectives to bolster democracy and defend human rights globally. USAID has made significant progress during the year of action to fulfill this commitment, and we continue to target individual, structural, and socioeconomic barriers to the political empowerment of women and girls. Our ecosystem approach aims to improve the environment for women's civic and political participation and leadership, while we simultaneously work to build the pipeline of women who are willing and ready to lead. Working alongside our local and international partners, USAID will provide more than $15 million to launch this initiative and improve the environment for women's leadership in 8 initial focus countries: Côte d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Tanzania, Colombia, Ecuador, Honduras, Kyrgyz Republic, and Yemen. We know, however, that the barriers to women's leadership are much larger than one donor can achieve alone, so we are seeking to leverage the efforts of other key partners as well. To this end, USAID has brought together a network for gender-inclusive democracy to provide strategic direction and a platform to coordinate these programmatic and diplomatic efforts. We are so pleased to be joined in the network by a diverse group of partners committed to improving coordination, knowledge management, and advocacy to advance gender-inclusive democracy and women's political participation and leadership. The breadth and depth of experience of these partners will enable us to leverage critical relationships, resources, and data necessary for gender-transforming outcomes. Initial network members include the governments of Australia, Spain, Sweden, and the UK, intergovernmental partners including UN Women, the Interparliamentary Union, the Inter-American Commission of Women of the Organization of American States, International IDEA, and Open Government Partnership, as well as civil society and leading academic partners. In addition, and in recognition of the growing tendency of anti-democratic actors to repress and silence their opponents through the misuse of technology, USAID is also launching the Transform Digital Spaces to Reflect Feminine Democratic Principles program, or Transform for short. Transform will invest up to $6 million over 3 years to understand, prevent, respond to, and mitigate the risk of technology-facilitated gender-based violence, including when perpetrated against women in politics and public life. Through Transform, we will contribute to the important work of the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse. First, though, we're going to have an opportunity now, before we're going to hear about that more in the second panel, but first we're going to have an opportunity to hear from several Summit for Democracy governments and partners on their efforts to advance gender equality and democracy. So I'm pleased to be joined on this panel by Her Excellency Sofia Kaltor, Sweden's Ambassador for Gender Equality, Her Excellency Ms. Alejandra Mora Mora, Executive Secretary of the Organization of American States, Inter-American Commission of Women. Now, Ms. Mora Mora will speak in Spanish, so please, this is a good opportunity to get your headset. There will be translation. And Mr. Shamil Idris, CEO of Search for Common Ground. So if you could join me up here on stage, that would be terrific. Thank you. Okay. Can everyone hear me? If it's okay with you, we will start with Her Excellency Sofia Kaltorp, who's Sweden's ambassador for gender equality. Sweden has been such a leader on gender equality, both at home, both domestically and abroad. You've been very vocal on the need for women's political participation, economic participation. It would be terrific to hear from you specifically about civic and political participation, and the progress that you've made against some of the goals that you've had during this year of action since the first Summit for Democracy.
Thank you very much for that question. And let me first thank you, Isabel, and the US government for your tremendous leadership when it comes to gender equality and democracy. And as we have already heard today, the inherent link between those two. And I think it cannot be repeated often enough that the status of women is the status of democracy. And to begin with your last question, I think one of the achievements that I'm most proud of during this year of action is the work that we have been doing together with our partners Romania, Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, and International IDEA in co-leading the cohort on gender equality as a prerequisite for democracy, where we have tried to look precisely at that question. How can we promote gender equality as a prerequisite for democracy? And what we have been doing is to identify the tools, and we have come up with a set of recommendations on how to galvanize the discussion, but I think more importantly, really look at how to create concrete action on the ground in order to make sure that women and girls enjoy their full human rights, and conversely contribute to solid democracies. As empowering women and safeguarding democracy go hand in hand, really to find the practical tools on how to do this on the ground is what we've been doing in this cohort during this year of action, and I'm very proud of that. But I would also like to highlight, as you know, and as you mentioned, Sweden, we have a long tradition of promoting gender equality, both at home and in our international relations. And one issue that we are looking particularly at right now is the issue of economic empowerment. And at the onset, one might not think that economic empowerment is a key to civic and political participation. But what we have come to realize is that economic empowerment is actually a prerequisite for democratic inclusion and for strengthening our democratic systems through greater women participation. So see how through economic empowerment we can promote civic and political participation in our action around the world together with partners is something that we look forward to continue, and it's been also focused during this year of action. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm so glad you are focused on economic empowerment, because I do think it's a prerequisite for many different forms of empowerment and inclusion. Alejandra, I will turn to you now. The OAS has been a real champion of women's empowerment throughout the Western Hemisphere, and it would be terrific to hear from you what we can learn from the Inter-American Commission on Women, the regional efforts to advance women's empowerment, particularly political participation, civic participation. What lessons learned from the work that you've been leading in the Western Hemisphere? What lessons can we take away from that that we could apply to other parts of the world too?
Yes, thank you so much for this space. Actually, the Inter-American Commission on Women accounts for the need to have in the multilateral space organizations watching out for and betting for equality as a mechanism for society, for democracy, for development. And the Inter-American Commission of Women was born 96 years ago, when in this country we were talking about suffragists. And it's these suffragists, these women who were at the time talking about as well of Pan-Americanism and how to articulate a political or regional body and bring that body bring to this body the inheritance of equality. And from there, the Inter-American Commission has worked with the topics of political issues and has had significant experiences which I'd like to share with you at this time. The first is to begin to put a last name to democracy, the last name of parity democracy. We've always talked about this. And for us, parity democracy is not only a number issue, which is very important, and which is not just an affirmative action. It is a question of justice, of distributive justice. If we are half of the population, then we should be represented at that same level. The second element of this is that it's not the same to arrive than to remain, that we occupy the conditions to exercise the power that's been given to us at the decision-making levels, and that for us, we'll be talking about political violence as one of the structural barriers that are pushing women again to return to the private world, which is from where we came out, and they remind us that we're side event guests, and that's why it's so important for us to talk about these barriers. The Belén do Pará Convention to prevent, sanction, repair violence against policies, which is one of the greatest instruments of the Inter-American Commission to talk about this issue. And the third element is that women's reality, those of us who are at the decision-making levels, must recognize that we have inherited the work of women who've worked here in the past, that we have inherited these actions, and that our planning and our programs must follow the agenda of those women who have worked in this. That's why equality, reivindication of women's rights, the maxims that nothing about us without us, the possibility of actually achieving that transformation done hand in hand with everyone, equal participation of women at decision-making levels, the exercise of power and the transforming agenda of women is so important. And I'll end, if I may, praising feminism by saying that it has been the most transforming movement. If we study what movements have changed the world, feminism, the voice of placing the women's needs and the understanding of the differential impact and the reivindication and the penetration into all spaces is done with violence, it's done with education, it's done with development. And now, at this moment, we understand that there is no democracy without women. These are all parts of the vision of the Inter-American Commission of Women and the need for us to work in partnership with multilateralism, national issues, local issues, and any civil society organization that place the women's voice as an important voice, which is part of democracy.
Well, I think that's a message to share with us, that there, of course, is no democracy without women. Very obvious, but we can't overstate it enough. Shema, let's turn to you and Search for Common Ground, which I know is doing some interesting work across the board on many of these issues, capacity building and with your Rapid Response Fund. I mean, maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of the interventions that you're doing in very practical ways to address the issues that we're talking today that face women in civic and political participation.
Thank you, Deputy Administrator Coleman, and thank you for having me here. So, we feel quite strongly that we have to support and fund women's-led civil society like we mean it. To that end, the last time we were together in November, we launched in partnership with the Office of Global Women's Issues the initiative that Secretary Blinken already mentioned in his opening remarks, the Women in New Security, or She Wins. We have She Knows in Slovenia, She Wins here. We have been receiving multiple applications a week, even in the initial rollout, and the pace has only picked up. It has enabled us to support young women activists in Bosnia and Herzegovina who wouldn't otherwise have an opportunity to talk to one another, to actually share information with each other, co-strategize, and work together. In Guatemala, in the lead up to the elections, She Wins has enabled us to support indigenous women's groups to help boost the participation of indigenous women in that election, because their participation rates are always historically very low in the democratic process. And so, although it's only been 5 months, we've actually sort of codified for this opportunity the lessons that we've learned in 4 ways. One is around promptness paired with participation, and the other one is proximity paired with pluralism. So just a sentence or so on each. Promptness is obvious, getting resources quickly to where they are needed, not only to meet long-held unmet needs, which we're receiving in these applications constantly, but also it's quite striking the degree to which women-led civil society oftentimes have their finger on the pulse of conflict dynamics that haven't quite made the news yet. So while we see increasing tensions and violence on the Tajik-Kyrgyz border over the last several years, hasn't made much news, but women's groups across those borders have applied and received support from She Wins to try to stem the violence. But that promptness has to be paired with preparation. I'm sure people in this room may be aware of the OECD report that came out several years ago now that looked at all aid for gender equality to conflict-affected or fragile states. All aid, of all of the aid that they looked at, less than 0.5% went to women-led civil society organizations. This is gender equality assistance to conflict-affected states, less than 0.5%, because the rest was going to either big trust funds or UN agencies or academic centers or men-led organizations, less than 0.5%. And so paired with promptness, we need preparation, because as we start supporting these women-led organizations, some of which have never gotten any external funding whatsoever, we need to support their ability not only to manage that funding, but their access to networks and future opportunities. Then there's proximity, and this goes very directly with the localization agenda that people are quite aware of, by this administration, but also in the private sector, in the philanthropic sector, that those affected by any intervention, this isn't, as you said, some of these insights are pretty obvious, but they don't always play out in real time. The people most affected, in this case, women's-led organizations, should be determining the direction of that intervention and the nature of it. But we need to pair that proximity, that support to local leadership, and their engagement in the process with pluralism, to make sure that as you start putting resources in, you're not fomenting new conflict dynamics and competition that is actually unhealthy. When we brought together Central African Republic women's-led organizations, we were struck not only by how many of them had never received any external funding of any kind, but also the degree to which many of them had not had an opportunity to share and co-strategize between them across their different dividing lines, how that kind of support should be played out. So those are the 4 lessons from us, at least so far in 5 months: promptness, preparation, proximity, and pluralism.
The 4 Ps. Excellent. Thank you. We have very little time left. I'm just going to ask each of you in 1 minute to give us a very tangible recommendation of what we all can do to put women first and women's empowerment first in all that we're doing. Sophia.
That's a difficult one. I think, first of all, we need to look beyond the obvious. Obviously, increasing women in parliament is something we need to work on. But equally, we need to address the structural issues. And I mentioned already economic empowerment, access to childcare, possibility to work are equally important for women's political and civic participation. And then I think we really need, and this has come up in the work of the cohort, stress and what is contrary to what is sometimes claimed, that gender equality and democracy are sort of Western phenomena. The gender equality and democracy are sort of inherent, it's fundamental questions of freedom. And the best way to protect freedom is, of course, through democracy. So looking at the issue of democracy and gender equality as universal values that we need to defend in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, but also in our own societies. And just to mention one thing, because I mean, having listened to Search for Common Ground, we work together in Yemen as a very practical example on how we can pursue this agenda in practice. So continue that work that you and we are doing together would be my last comment. Thank you.
Alejandra, 1 minute on putting women front and center for democratic resilience.
Well, to understand that it is the win-win decision. Without us, decisions made are incomplete, are missing that millenarian years of women in the world, in the private world, in the fact that we have generated a series of skills that have to do with negotiations, with empathy, with care, and do, as we're doing right now, carrying the mainstreaming of society, which wants to go from abandonment to a position of care, who wants to place in the center of our reflections persons, people, and not things. So it's a win-win decision, and it also has to do with the possibility of changing the narrative of leadership. As long as leadership continues to be what it is believed to be, which is the exercise of power traditionally in the hands of men, without including in that narrative the specificity of women's leadership, the emotion, the differentiated skills that women have, so that we bring to the table a different element which makes democracy to be including all the diversities, and that it can be comprehensive and not incomplete without us.
Any paradigm shift will start with a lot of talk, and which, if it never translates into anything else, it becomes lip service. I think that the fact that She Wins is administered in the flexible way that it is, it's not the biggest project that we manage, but it's certainly one of the most powerful because of the flexibility. And the lesson that I would take out of it, to answer your question specifically, is if we want equitable partnerships with the women-led organizations that we're working with, we need to ensure that they're involved in setting the priorities, in determining how the activities are designed and run, in deciding how resources are going to flow, and designing how success will be measured and assessed. This is allowing us to do that. More efforts, whether from the government of Sweden, that's been a pioneer, or others that enable those things to happen, will be the top lesson for me.
Thank you. This has been terrific. Thank you to our panelists. I take away putting local-led women organizations at the front, democracy as a universal human value with women very much at the center of that, and changing the narrative on power, basically. I think these are all great lessons for us, and please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.
Hello, friends. It's me again. Thank you, Ambassador Kaltorp, Executive Secretary Mora Mora, Mr. Idris, Deputy Administrator Coleman, for that excellent discussion and your leadership. I mean, I was watching this panel thinking that every single one of you at some point had really been partners in pushing, making sure that gender was included in every aspect of all the work that you did, and for highlighting the progress made under the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal, which demonstrates the universal importance of women and girls' civic and political participation and leadership for strong and healthy democracies. Next, I'm going to turn your attention back to the screen for an introduction to our next panel discussion on collective actions to counter gender-based online harassment and abuse. Please welcome the Foreign Minister of Denmark, Lars Løkke Rasmussen.
Distinguished guests, colleagues and partners, it is an honor to join you today. Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for hosting this important conversation. Today's fight for gender equality is as much through our phones as it is in the streets or in the boardroom. Technology has expanded the space for civic and political participation. We can protest, campaign, and share our voices through online platforms and new technologies. But new technologies come with new challenges as well. New technologies have expanded the space in which gender-based violence and harassment can happen. This is especially true for women, girls, and marginalized communities such as the LGBT+ community. And the data is mind-blowing. Half of young women and girls globally have experienced online abuse. 3 in 4 women journalists have experienced some form of online violence. And women in politics are more often targets of online hate and disinformation than their male counterparts. I witnessed that firsthand myself, where talented female colleagues have been targets of unbelievable amounts of online hate. At the first Summit for Democracy, we were proud to come together with the United States and partners to announce the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse. Denmark's Tech for Democracy initiative has brought together decision makers from industry, government, and civil society to create solutions to global challenges in the digital era. With the Global Partnership, we bring together a diverse set of voices across countries, organizations, civil society, companies, and survivors, all with a shared goal to address violence and harassment online as one of the biggest barriers to women's full and meaningful political participation. 1 year later, we are now 12 countries and more than 30 stakeholders from all over the world.
We are grateful for our close relationship with Denmark, especially on the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Violence, Online Harassment, and Abuse. That might be the only thing we have never put into an acronym, so we might want to work on that. Since the announcement of the Global Partnership at the first Summit for Democracy and its launch at the Commission on the Status of Women in 2022, the Global Partnership has doubled in size and convened a multi-stakeholder advisory group. Over the last year, we have seen through the Global Partnership the necessity of collective multi-sector action to address gender-based online harassment and abuse. For our next panel, we are pleased to feature some experts and leaders from the Global Partnership's advisory group, our important partners in civil society, who will discuss their efforts to address one of the biggest barriers to women's civic and political participation, online harassment and abuse. Please help me welcome our moderator, Sandra Pepra, who is also one of my personal heroes, and the Director of Gender, Women, and Democracy at the National Democratic Institute. Sandra and her team have been instrumental in the launch and subsequent efforts of the Global Partnership. Sandra, please join us. Thank you.
I want to do that woman life thing again. Women?
Life?
Life? Freedom. Okay. I'm going to take that back to NDI, you know. Kat, thank you so much for that generous and warm welcome. And good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all of you wherever you are, because there are people beyond this room, we hope, who are listening in. As our former board chair, the late Secretary Madeleine Albright said, while misogyny is not a problem that tech can solve, misogyny online is. Based on our knowledge of the near universality of this phenomenon, and this is variously called tech-facilitated gender-based violence, online violence, harassment and abuse. If it walks like a duck, people, we know what it means, right? Based on our understanding of the near universality of this phenomenon, last fall, NDI worked with many survivors, colleagues around the world, and indeed members of the Global Partnership, to develop a set of interventions to really address this issue. There is a consensus emerging around a few things. First of all, to find ways to shift the burden of preventing, countering, and ending online violence from individual women to a more systemic response. Folks, we're tired. Second, that technology companies need to cease the practice of profiting from hate. Governments must extend the protections that they are duty-bound to provide in the physical world to women and girls experiencing online violence in the online space. And the media sets setting a tone for the safe participation of women in politics and public life, including women journalists, environmental activists, and human rights defenders. But we are living in a world where there are, according to the Varieties of Democracy report, 3 times more swiftly autocratizing than democratizing states, 42 to 14. And in that context, there does seem to be no alternative than to focus on coordinated action and multi-sectoral approaches. We're dealing with a global movement of democratic backsliding that has particular anti-pluralist and anti-equality characteristics, including political polarization. Quoting from the VDEM report, the countries witnessing the most dramatic increases in polarization include top autocratizers such as Afghanistan, Brazil, India, and Myanmar. End quote. Which is a shame because, the politically led assaults on gender equality, women's empowerment, and minority rights, all kinds of minority rights, in each of those countries over the last few years has been of a visceral nature. The Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse reflects the key learning from last year's Freedom on the Net report, which showed that the countries that saw the most progress on internet freedom used a multi-sectoral approach. Throughout the year of action, the Global Partnership has also worked very closely with the Summit for Democracy's gender cohort, as you heard from the last panel, with 2 key recommendations being presented for the consideration of the partnerships in this week's summit discussions. One recommendation was on the adoption of legal standards. I'll ask our panelists about that later. The other recommendation is for greater collaboration with social media companies and increasing coordination between the platforms and law enforcement entities, particularly for response and holding perpetrators accountable. But let's hear from our panelists, who are leaders in their fields, and all working to promote democracy through the advancements of human rights, inclusion, and pluralism, including by addressing online harassment and abuse. It is my privilege to ask you to welcome Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice, Desiree Cormier-Smith from the US State Department, and 2 members of the Global Partnerships Advisory Group, Phumzile Van Dam, a former member of Parliament in South Africa and an electoral disinformation expert, and Christina Wilford, a co-founder of Sheep Assisted, an organization that leverages the voices of women leaders globally and ensures they are part of crucial conversations on the digital platform reform. Thank you. Desiree, can I call you just Desiree?
Yes, please. I know it's a long title.
So I'm always equally delighted and mystified whenever I meet a first in a particularly important area as late as 2023. So you're the first special representative for racial equity and justice. What can your mandate do to spotlight the technology-facilitated gender-based violence faced by women and girls with intersecting identities?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for having me, and thank you to my colleague, Kat, for her leadership on this really important issue. And I'm really glad we're talking about this issue, but starting with my mandate. My mandate was created in June of 2022. So I've been in this role now for 9 months. And my mandate is twofold. Is to ensure that U.S. foreign policy programs, processes, and assistance is serving to advance and promote the human rights of members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities, including people of African descent, and that U.S. foreign policy programs, processes, and assistance is combating structural racism, discrimination, and xenophobia globally. not because we have solved those challenges here in the United States, but because we recognize we are not the only country struggling with these challenges. We recognize racism as a global challenge that will require coordinated and sustained global solutions. I mentioned my mandate, and I'm very happy to be on this panel because every single crisis that we're facing has a different and disproportionate impact on members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities. And that is so true when we talk about online gender-based violence. As I was preparing for this panel, I was doing a little bit of research, and I was dumbfounded by the numbers, the data. I saw one Amnesty International report that was released in 2018 that said that Black women are 84% more likely to be abused on social media than white women. Let me repeat that. Black women are 84% more likely to be abused on social media than white women. That is stark. And for me, that really crystallizes the fact that we cannot take a one-size-fits-all approach to this issue or any other issue, but particularly this issue. A one-size feminism is not going to be big enough for all of us. I will stop there because I'm really interested in hearing from my
But before you do, I want to just extend that a little bit further, because my understanding of intersectionality is that it's not actually a benign phenomenon. We see it every day being used politically in digital spaces and elsewhere to divide women from other women, as you've just illustrated, and from other marginalized groups.
Yeah.
So, are there any effective emerging multisectoral practices that you have come across in your work with others working in this area, in this particular nexus, that you can share with us?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question. And I want to make the point because intersectionality has become a very popular term recently. I think it was in the wake of the horrific murder of George Floyd, when people started acknowledging the realities of systemic racism, not only in the United States, but around the world. And then women and other marginalized folks said, hey, but it's even worse for some of us who have multiple and compounding, who face multiple and compounding forms of discrimination because we are many things at once. I want to be clear, as you note, intersectionality is a term coined by a brilliant Black woman named Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. That term intersectionality is not a positive thing. It is not a positive thing. The term intersectionality refers to the fact that people who are, for instance, women and Black and LGBTQI+, and who have a disability, and who may be a religious minority, face multiple and compounding forms of discrimination because of those various identities. So the concept of intersectionality is not a positive thing. Being multiple things is a positive thing. You know, that is lovely, and I embrace the fact that I'm a woman, I'm also Black, I'm Christian, I'm all of these things, and that's great. But the reality is, because I'm all these things, I face different and multiple and intersecting and compounding forms of discrimination. So it's really important that we acknowledge that and we understand what intersectionality is. Now, how we address that, right, especially in this space, is the point that one of the previous panelists made before, is to talk to these women, center their voices. And I want to be clear that participation in and of itself is not power, okay? So we can bring someone into the room, but where are they sitting? And if they're at the table, what end of the table are they at? Are they at a chair that's lower than anyone else, right? Do they have the opportunity to speak? And is it, you know, are we including their feedback in meaningful and ongoing ways, not only in the design of projects or policies, but also in the ongoing sort of monitoring of success in that project? And so I would say it is so critically important to talk to Black women, to talk to Indigenous women, to talk to Asian American women and other women who are from marginalized racial, ethnic, and Indigenous communities, because the data is clear. They are facing even more severe forms of online hate and abuse because of the double whammies of racism and sexism. And so I would say they have to be a meaningful part of these discussions in an ongoing way.
And of course, the fact that women are finding themselves needing to self-censor or be silent or to remove themselves from those spaces has huge implications for democracy. And that's why we're here. And from Zile, Secretary Blinken mentioned that you had been forced to share your story. And we're not going to ask you to do that today, but really just to ask you to give a sense of what being politically active in an electoral kind of environment can be like for women who are trying to stand up and simply claim their space and their rightful space.
Sure. Firstly, I must say it's really great to be here and be with women and men who do this important work about gender equality and particularly against online violence against women. So while I'm part of this kind of global activism, academia activists, I have decided to focus my attention a lot on Africa because I found it to be an area that is not given enough attention by the global community. So my work revolves around elections because we've found that elections are the key drivers for disinformation. And over the last while, I've been particularly looking at Russian disinformation and how it impacts democracy in Africa. So from South Africa, where it's more kind of a ideological warfare, where South Africa is a useful arena for the BRICS summit, where in defiance of other countries in the world, Putin will be invited, unlikely to come, but anyway, where it's a useful arena to have a show of might with naval drills with South Africa, Russia, and China. But in other parts of Africa, it has offline consequences. It has Russian disinformation is in support of autocrats. It's in support of coups. It's in support for the suppression of the rights of the people of Africa. And in situations like that, who will always be at the bottom? It will always be a rural woman. And this means that it's intersectional, right? So being at the bottom means you don't have access to jobs, healthcare, you're unlikely to be online, you have less space to participate meaningfully in the online space. And how it affects women leaders who perhaps have had the privilege to be able to stand for office is that they often decide just, I won't be online. There's no point in me being online, and that means that they don't have use to a critical platform for campaigning. You need to be online. So the solution is an intersectional whole of society solution. So it is gender equality, making sure that women have access to the resources that they need to make successful lives for themselves. It is tackling disinformation. And part of that solution is looking at what the platforms are doing. It's been exciting to see that the AU, I think it's one of the first kind of multilateral bodies to recognize online gender-based violence as a real threat, and have put out a resolution about that. So hopefully that will, reach the countries it needs to. But yeah, it's incredibly tough to be a woman online. And the way I have decided is I'll be here, I will claim my space, I will say what I have to say. I don't care if you disagree with me, cyberbully me, I will, yeah. But it's not all women have to experience the online space like that, and we really need to do as much as we can to make sure that women are able to use the online space to express themselves, raise issues that face women so that, there's that intersectional change required to better support women.
Thanks very much, Fumze. I mean, our colleagues at CITE, the Center for International Private Enterprise, have also got a take on this. I mean, what they see is that women entrepreneurs, women in the private sector, are also being faced with an inability to be, if you like, fully present and fully engaged and fully advantaged by being in the online space. So to your point, there are a wide circle of empowerment issues to be addressed through this issue, but obviously for us, that starting point about political leadership, political engagement, political mobilization is key. I mentioned earlier, one of the recommendations emerging from the Summit for Democracy's gender cohort focused on the adoption of legal standards around zero tolerance for all forms of gender-based violence online and within political parties. As a former MP, as somebody who has a lens on the legislative processes, the relationship between executives and legislatures in Africa, what do you think? Is this something that we should be supportive of? Are there caveats? Are there opportunities that you think we could be taking advantage of in this context?
Absolutely. You know, there's legislation in place about achieving gender equality elsewhere except the online space. And I think it is important to recognize that this is an area that requires intervention. And I think I'm trying to say this in the nicest way as possible, is that, lawmakers don't necessarily always understand the online space. They don't understand why it is important. What is said online matters, and you need to have policies in place. You need to understand how those platforms work. So I really would like to see people in my former field of work taking greater interest in the digital space. In my work in Parliament, you know, I did a lot of work around tech oversight and the digital space, and when I left, nobody else is doing that anymore. So I'd really, really encourage policymakers and lawmakers to invest time in understanding the space and understanding that you need to make laws that protect and do not shut down free speech. Policies that will not shut down access to social media platforms. We need more freedom of speech, but we need to make sure that women are protected against hate, children are protected. So the answer is yes. We need the laws and policies in place.
Thanks so much, Mzile. Christina. No, just stop it. Christina, first of all, congratulations on your Chief Assistant's recent study, Monetizing Misogyny. Love the alliteration there. And the newly released country reports on Hungary and Italy. So what lessons can we take from those case studies and apply to our efforts to counter gender disinformation in particular, which is, if you like, the uber weaponization of everything else around the world?
I think it's important to first start to understand that there are no borders on this. There are no levels of office, whether you're a minister of foreign affairs, the head of state, or you're a candidate for a local city office. You are going to be targeted. And this is the overall trends that we're speaking to in mapping this in She Persisted, which we're putting a different angle on to focus on what are some of the systemic issues that are driving this. And that really involves the role of social media. So we, I think, have been mostly in an era where we've thought about social media as a democratizing force, especially for women. And what we've seen is that this is no longer a mirror being held up to society reflecting its existing misogyny and sexism. It is a behavioral modification machine. And so when we're mapping these trends and we're looking at, you know, what is new here, it really is the role and choices of big tech itself. Nobel Peace Prize winning journalist Maria Ressa talks about this on the behavioral modification side and the choices of the platforms. Algorithms aren't just set by robots, right? There's humans behind this. And those are the editorial choices that the platforms are making. So when we look at in Italy, when we look at Hungary, when we now also mapping Tunisia, Yemen in the context of war, Ukraine in the context of war, Brazil, and we can see two major trends. One is that it's not just the attacking women, although that's a big part of it, to achieve illiberal goals, but it's also transforming gender equality as an idea and distorting it. So everything I heard on panel 1 will be undermined in the matter of, I think, years because of this massive engine that is trying to distort our political discourse on whether it's a feminist foreign policy or some of the other important issues that we spoke to. I just returned from Kenya on Sunday, and speaking to what we've discussed here, a young candidate who ran from Mombasa. She's Muslim, she's young, she is disabled, and she was the target of a massive disinformation campaign using faked videos, pornographic videos of her, supposedly of her image, also fetishizing her disability. So these are all of sort of the things that we see in these women who are targeted. And to ask her to have resilience towards this is cruel. What we need is to expand our idea of resiliency to the way that we approach the role of technology, even in our framing. We're calling this, many different things as the field is evolving, which is important. Technology facilitated online gender-based violence, gender disinformation, GBVO. I mean, whatever we call it, what we need to do is center the systemic choices of social media companies in what they are doing to, in fact, monetize this. So that was a conscious title that we made in the report to say that this is monetizing misogyny because it's profitable. These choices are ultimately profitable. And so if we step back, and I think this is important for today, and really marking a moment in time where we see this as a national security threat. I don't like to use the term strongmen political leaders because they're weak men, let's be real. But that's an important part of how we think about their goals, whether it's an Orban or it's in Erdogan, in Turkey, the way that even the Istanbul Convention, which is a treaty to protect against violence, that was distorted to say that this is an issue of LGBTQ rights, which are important, but it's a different set of issues. That distortion is undermining all the progress that we've made. And they're using really this chauvinistic nationalism, is what I would describe it as, to get there. So I just want to end on one last point because it's always present given my work in Ukraine, was doing some mapping really recently. And we don't think about an issue like the invasion of Ukraine, war in Ukraine, as one that has a gender dimension. But if we think about the days before the election, or before the invasion, you had an analogy made by Putin about speaking of taking Ukraine, which is essentially a rape metaphor. Ukraine depicted as a prostitute to the West is a major part of the propaganda and mis and disinformation. There is no country, no topic, no development that is not touched by the way that gender disinformation is meant to undermine those developments. And so that's what we're really, speaking to. I just want to end by saying we have somewhat, I think, upward of 70 elections coming in 2024 in very fragile environments. South Africa, I would include US as a fragile environment when it comes to attacks against the election, as well as India, Indonesia, the entire European Parliament. So this will be a supersized mis and disinformation opportunity, and women will bear the brunt of that. We have upward of around 3 billion people eligible to vote for the first time in these elections. And I am not sure that we can have the resiliency and we can fight against the forces that will be trying to undermine those elections and democracy itself without a change in the system.
Thanks very much, Christina. I think those points were absolutely key. Yeah, do. Go ahead. And I'm looking sideways just because I'm not sure we're good on time, okay? But I think, again, you kind of picked on a number of things. First of all, the fact that the choices being made by the companies are deliberate and they are human-led, right? So, how do we address some of those issues? But I think the distortions that really play on current and pre-existing social fault lines are very important to understand, because there are ways in which different messages impact different groups in that way. And this othering is hugely problematic, and it does sit, to your point, in that broad area of growing autocracy and illiberalism. 3 billion people may be having elections next year, but again, according to VDEM, for the first time in a long time, 72% of the world's population is living under autocratic or illiberal states. So this rollback is really massive on the democracy side, and it does have a leading edge, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, which is anti-equality and anti-gender and anti-equity. And I think we need to really appreciate that going forward. Phumzile, next year, South Africa is having elections.
Yeah.
Does your reading of the situation, which is, again, it's a political situation. I think we've worked quite hard to situate this issue as a rights issue, but fundamentally as an issue of democracy and politics and power as well. What is your reading of that going to suggest?
I think compared to the rest of the continent, South Africa has the benefit of being a strong constitutional democracy, where elections will be free and fair, where disinformation will be a struggle, but I think it's a population that's very aware of disinformation and the dangers thereof. In those elections coming up next year, I'm incredibly worried about other parts of Africa. Zimbabwe is coming up, particularly in instances where it's autocracies, where there's foreign influence operations from Russia, from Turkey, from China. So it's those that I'm incredibly worried about. South Africa is, of course, going to be something that's on my agenda, but my anxiety and my fear is for the rest of the continent. And I really would like to encourage that those of us that do this work, I know Christina does a lot of work around the world and in Africa, that there's more interest paid in what's happening in the continent. I think Russia and China, they've given up on trying to convince the West about, their topics, and it's now based in Africa. So looking at kind of the disinformation operations where the majority of the accounts are, those accounts are based in Africa, in Kenya and South Africa and other parts of the continent. So South Africa, cautiously optimistic. Rest of Africa, incredibly frightened, but rolling up my sleeves, and I'd like to invite everyone to join me and the work Christina does and a lot of other organizations. We're small, but we're mighty and we're deeply passionate and would love more support from the global community.
Well done. There are some, to your point, small but increasingly mighty feminist civic organizations around Africa, some of whom the Global Partnership is very well aware of, and we've engaged with through the advisory committee. So there's that. But it's a difficult one to really kind of grasp hold of. And to your point, the scale and the vigilance that's going to be needed across not only the continent, but across the world next year, is of a different nature. Desiree? Yes. No, not at all. When you're thinking about the issues on how some people call it computational propaganda actually impacts different populations, what do you think we could do beyond being survivor-centered? How do we first of all, what's our early warning system? Yeah. What is our rapid response? what do you think we should be doing more of in all these cases?
Yeah, and when you say we, are we talking about governments or civil society or just everyone?
Well, we collectively. Right now, you're in government.
Yes, I am in government now. I have to remind myself of that sometimes, because I was previously in civil society. I think, you know, it's listening to those who are doing the work on the ground, right? One saying that I love, and I know it's cliche, is those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. But I think it's really important when we're talking about issues as critical as online information, as online abuse, particularly in the run-up of so many elections, and the elections that can determine the fate of a country, of a region, and in some cases in geopolitics much more broadly. You know, one thing I join a collection of other ambassadors and special envoys who focus on other marginalized populations. So I joined Kat Vodovac, who leads the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues. I joined Special Envoy Jessica Stern to advance the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons. Sarah Mankaras, the Special Advisor for International Disability Rights. Rashad Hussain is the ambassador for international religious freedom, and Deborah Lipstadt is the ambassador to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. I list all of them because every single one of us always says, our population is the canary in the coal mine. And it's true. We see it online. We see it with autocrats around the world. We see it in any single instance of democratic backsliding. They may start with Jewish people. They may start with people of African descent, but they're not going to end there. They may start with anti-LGBTQI+ legislation, but they're not going to end there. And so I think that's what we need to keep in mind. Now, the U.S. State Department has all of these ambassadors and envoys focused on marginalized populations because we believe that when human rights of every single person, regardless of their identity, when their rights are protected, everyone else is better off. Everyone else is better off. And so I think we need to follow the canary in the coal mine and not view it as an isolated issue, right? Not view it as just an LGBTQI+ bill, but to see it as the canary in the coal mine for broader democratic backsliding. We see this in numerous countries around the world, not just in Africa, but right now we're seeing a lot of it on the continent as it comes to anti-LGBTQI+ legislation, but also when it comes to targeting migrants of African descent, right? Again, the canary in the coal mine. So I think it's really important that we pay attention to that democratic backsliding and see it as such, and not try and silo it off or minimalize it as simply a human rights issue, right? Because I think we do that, governments do that too often, instead of seeing it as a critical piece of a broader national security landscape or democratic backsliding.
Right, thank you. And Christina, I'm going to give you the last word, and I'm going to ask you if you were president for the day, I guess I can't say queen here, can I? If you were president for the day, what would you really ask of the global partnership? You know, what's the essential next thing, given all that's been said this afternoon? What's your wish for the global partnership?
It is regulation. It is establishing a duty of care for essentially harmful products that are hurting people. So we have to think about it that way. If we look at sort of the history of, you know, big oil, big pharma, big tobacco, their abusive practices were not reined in by self-regulation. And so we get very fearful, and these conversations enter into this sort of dystopian idea of like it's out of our control and we can't do anything. If we look at the Digital Services Act, which is the gold standard in Europe, will be implemented next year, there are elements there that can be replicated in different geographic areas. Brazil is moving forward. The urgency to move to address not only gender disinformation, mis and disinformation was made very clear by an attempted insurrection January 8th. That was also tied in to this nationalistic chauvinism and to gender specifically. So there are remedies, there are things to be replicated. A well-defined problem is half the solution. The global partnership is an important position to speak some truth to what's going on here to try to combat the arguments around free expression. There is no free expression for women who are doxxed. There's no free expression if you're not able to participate equally online, whether you're a journalist, an activist at the forefront of these democracy movements, or running for office. So I think we have to embolden ourselves a bit that we can tackle this. I mean, if I look at some of the market pressure points, that is another area outside of regulation that those of us in civil society and academia and others can embrace. 40% of advertisers left Twitter not because there was a new law passed, but because advertisers see this as a brand reputation problem. So the market pressure points are an opportunity to organize around, to combine with civil society, to strengthen philanthropy, not just to have women sort of manage the problem and fund this notion of resilience that isn't dealing with the systemic causes. So there's no shortage of solutions. We have to have the political will, the courage to do this, and I think we can make great progress.
Great. Thank you.
Well, I am fired up after that panel. I have heard all four of these women speak on separate occasions, and every time I get so inspired and I'm like, we're going to make change. But now all four of you together, what an amazing rock star panel. So my sincere thanks, Desiree, Fumzilia, Christina, and of course, Sandra. Your work to prevent and respond to gender-based violence online, harassment and abuse, to advance the rights of women and girls in all of their diversity truly has been unparalleled, and you have really set the baseline for operating in so many countries and really changed lives. So my sincere thanks to this entire panel. You know, I want to give another round of applause to everyone that's gathered in this room. I'm seeing so many friends that I haven't seen for a long time, so many activists, so many civil society organizations, and of course government officials. You know, it's been just an honor to be able to work with everyone to contribute to such an action-oriented discussion and making sure that the Summit for Democracy really is creating an effective change. I want to again thank our incredible speakers, our moderators, Isabel, Sandra, Jen Klein, Secretary Blinken. Thank you all for uplifting women and girls in all their diversity and all of your work. So I'm very happy to say that we are concluding today's event with a call to action. I'm looking at everyone online, everyone in this audience. You know, I used to belong to an online women's group that advocated for political action, and we would get attacked on a regular basis. And I must say, we used to have this call saying, tag me in, because people would go after each other. And so making sure that you all know to collectively, this is a multi-sectoral approach. We all need to tag each other in. So again, I am just overly thrilled with this entire event and filled with hope and enthusiasm. Today's exchanges and discussions have provided us with a springboard into further action and a roadmap for what action actually looks like. I'm confident that we leave this room today with a renewal and commitment to advancing women and girls' civic and political participation as foundational to strengthening democracy and expanding our efforts to address technology-facilitated gender-based violence as a barrier to gender equality. We all know the road ahead is by no means easy. The safety and ability of women and girls in all their diversity to exercise their rights on and offline is increasingly under attack from a long list of threats, including gender-based discrimination and violence, silencing and forcing them to withdraw from civic spaces. However, I'm encouraged by the successes of our panelists and others who have achieved to advance women's participation, which the U.S. government and our partners are reinforcing through our policy and programs, such as the National Strategy on Gender Equity and Equality, the U.S. Strategy on Women, Peace, and Security, our updated U.S. Strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally, and our recently launched U.S. Strategy on Women's Global Economic Security. And through our programs, our office supports, such as She Persists and She Wins. I am proud of the impressive strides we have made in just 1 year through the global partnership to improve the response to technology-facilitated gender-based violence, and particularly pressing and challenging barriers to women's political participation, and to promote effective prevention strategies. I want to thank our global partnership countries and advisors for their hard work and dedication. We forge ahead with these efforts. I draw strength and inspiration and continue to look across the countless example of women and girls across the globe who continue to fight back day in and day out. The women who refuse to be silenced in the face of harassment and threats, who demand that their voices be heard, such as in my home country of birth, Iran. I am an Iranian American, and again, I stand for their voices as well. I had the honor of spending a lot of time over the past 2 weeks with our 2023 International Women of Courage Award recipients, who were truly a galvanizing force. And we had our International Women of Courage Award ceremony at the White House this year. Humble brag. Hearing their stories of strength, leadership, and persistence in the face of adversity, seeing their drive and enthusiasm and compassion and true courage, simply being in their presence, is both humbling and reinvigorating. During our conversations today, the experiences of one of our 2023 awardees in particular, Polish humanitarian journalist Bianca Zaleska, has been really on the forefront of my mind. In the face of intimidation, death threats, and physical attacks, including shootings, while delivering humanitarian aid, Bianca has selflessly documented Russian aggression in Ukraine since 2014. Since the invasion, she has continued her work documenting war crimes, lifting up stories of refugees, crowdsourcing essential resources, and training other journalists to effectively counter misinformation. And she is one of the kindest people I have ever met. She persists in the face of disinformation campaigns and threats, serious threats from Russian-backed internet trolls personally aimed at her and her family, and the risks of violence and injury during her frequent work inside Ukraine. In the face of ever-present threats, Bianca remains unintimidated and continues to welcome refugees from Ukraine, bringing to light Russian atrocities, report truthfully and responsibly from the front lines, and personally deliver aid inside Ukraine. Through our work at the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues, I'm proud to continue standing with Bianca and all other women across the globe who we continue to chip away at barriers to women's meaningful participation in civic spaces and to advance gender equality across the globe. Let us lift our voices together for all these women, for inclusive democracies, and for women around the world who cannot speak for themselves. Thank you all again. I look forward to working with you, and tag me in whenever you need to. With that, we are concluded.